I've asked each of my colleagues here to speak for a few minutes about a little bit about their story and a little bit about what they do. We don't have time for full, in-depth briefings on all four of the topics that they focus on, but if they can give you a taste of what they do, then we can give you the opportunity to pose questions to them, and then over the course of the rest of today and your future interactions with the Institute, you'll have a chance to speak in greater depth with each of them. So, Dan, we'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. Just a little quickly about my background. I've been in the Naval Reserves for about 10 years. I get promoted next month, Lieutenant Commander. Finished my PhD at George Washington University last year. Did 2 years in Afghanistan and then 6 months in Iraq doing tribal political engagement. And then also having worked at State Department and the OSD Policy Secretary of Defense's office, a lot of my perspective on Yemen is sort of informed by this sort of collection of experiences. So I sort of think always, what is the academic perspective? What is the theoretical perspective? I also think about how does this work in Washington? How do the bureaucracies respond and think through the problems they are trying to work through? And then also I also think about how we implement things on the ground, practically speaking. So a lot of my perspective is informed by those sets of experiences. And so when I view Yemen and when I think through the challenges we face there with respect to al-Qaeda and trying to foster a stable government that can confront it, I see a lot of sort of a lack of lessons learned, not just in terms of the Obama administration, but specifically about our own bureaucracies and how they operate. My view on this is sort of there are three broad trends that have informed our approach to Yemen. One is sort of the legacies, enduring realities of Iraq and Afghanistan, and the struggle about what lessons there are that we've learned from those experiences. Two, of course, is the Arab Spring. There's so many countries in flux and so many issues that are being worked currently. Yemen just doesn't sort of stack up against the more pressing concerns about Syria, Egypt, and other places. And then finally, of course, our own country's sort of challenges, economic issues, budget issues. So a lot of the approach we have in Yemen, which is predominantly two things. One is the use of drone strikes to degrade al-Qaeda's capabilities. And then secondly, sort of modest investments in military assistance and civilian assistance to help the Yemenis approach the problem and deal with it on their own. So a lot of my perspective is gleaned from the lessons I've personally learned from those things I've mentioned previously, and then try to write about it in a way that's friendly advice to the government, that's constructive, but most importantly is can be implemented. And if for what it's worth is maybe a little wise about how to approach this problem set. So much of what I write tends to end up in military journals. I've had an opportunity to testify before Congress once on this subject, and a lot of my writing is geared towards that. And then to that end, I'm going on my first trip to Yemen in July, just 12 days. We'll start modestly. And going to do a lot of interviews with Yemeni government officials with the goal of sort of understanding the challenges they have of extending government out to the areas al-Qaeda is strongest, because often al-Qaeda is strong where the government's weak, predatory, or corrupt, or non-existent, and sort of helping to understand their problem set and then through that inform the government so they might approach this in a more constructive way. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Now, you're probably asking yourself, what are we doing having somebody focus on Yemen, right? When the Washington Institute was founded, Yemen was, shall we say, not even on the agenda. But this is part of the new agenda. I mean, what did al-Qaeda do before they went to New York? They attacked the USS Cole off the coast of Yemen. Where is al-Qaeda most powerful today? Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in Yemen. And so what Dan is able to do is take the lessons from 2 years on the ground doing what General Allen spoke about. If you remember tribal engagement in Sitar and his story 2 nights ago, Dan was doing this one-on-one on the ground in Iraq and in Afghanistan and is applying the lessons of that to where the problem is most serious in Arab countries today, which is not very high on most people's agenda, but can really touch us in very negative ways. And to have someone of Dan's experience and background and enthusiasm to do this is just fantastic. So thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Lori, you're up next.
You're up. It's terrific to be back at the Institute. I've been saying to family and friends for 16 years now, since I was a Soref Fellow, that my favorite work experience was when I was at the Institute. And frankly, it's had become quite embarrassing to say that my favorite job was in the mid-1990s. So I'm very happy to be back and to use the favorite job epithet for my current work. It's wonderfully apparent how much the Institute has grown now that I see from the inside as well as I've tracked from the outside over the years, not only in size but in reach to multiple constituencies in Washington and beyond Washington, and in its footprint in the American Middle East policy community. It's truly an honor for me to be back in this very special and unique organization. I'm focusing on political dynamics in the oil-rich Persian Gulf states, along with my esteemed new colleagues Simon Henderson, David Pollack, Mike Knights, among others. And as Moses mentioned, I spent the last decade or so working in the intelligence community. Before that, I lived in Kuwait for a year where I conducted research for a book on Kuwaiti domestic security, traveled in the Gulf, and also did a short stint each at Brookings and at RAND. Now, I imagine that mention of the small Gulf states might elicit some yawning in the audience, but I find it a very enjoyable and entertaining region to watch. I don't know if you caught the latest really critical security news out of Saudi Arabia last week. I want to share it with you. So the title of one of the articles about the news was, Saudi Arabia deports irresistible men deemed too handsome to women. The article goes on to say that 3 men were forcibly removed from a culture festival after it was deemed that women could find them irresistible.
And they're all on this panel.
That's right. We better be careful with our scholars traveling to Saudi Arabia.
Why aren't you including me in that?
The Saudi religious police evicted the men because they were too handsome and they feared female visitors would fall for them. Now, if that's not entertaining research, I don't know what is. And I hope you'll enjoy following Gulf politics with me over time. My current research focuses on evaluating how our Gulf security partners are managing the destabilizing political dynamics, and in some cases flashpoints, in these countries and U.S. policy with regard to this. Of course, much of these destabilizing dynamics have to do with new popular demands for change linked to the Arab Spring environment. From my perspective, these regimes have been doing quite well and have weathered these the Arab Spring storm, if you will, quite well, as they have many other regional storms in the past. They are using a three-pronged approach to address opposition in their countries, as they have in the past. One is to crack down on dissent. 2 is to bend to some degree, in some ways, to some demands for change. And 3 is to issue monetary and welfare rewards to their citizens and essentially continue to co-opt them and enhance their legitimacy in this very traditional way in the Gulf and the Arab world in general of granting favors. Bahrain is one of the most interesting cases of this, where there's essentially a low-level Shia insurgency outside the capital, but the Al Khalifa regime has done quite a good job dividing the opposition at various times during the last 2 years, first subtracting the Sunni element from the protests, and second, kind of trapping the main Shia opposition in this national dialogue, which, as you probably know, is really going nowhere. These destabilizing dynamics there are a lot of implications for U.S. policy. One of them is that, and how, not only the destabilizing dynamics, but also how the regimes are dealing with them. One lesson is that the regimes have proven relatively durable, and we can rely on them as security partners for the foreseeable future. At the same time, I think it's our responsibility and in our interest and in their interest to encourage them to be a little bit more gracious, move a little bit more quickly with their responses to popular demands for change so that they don't bottleneck and explode. And of course, this is in our interest and this is in their interest as well. In conclusion, I'd like to cite one potentially destabilizing political dynamic that doesn't have to do with the Arab Spring, that's a little bit behind the news. It's fun to think about. Since I've worked in the intelligence community in the last few years, I've learned to enjoy this game of risk assessment, and it really is a guessing game, although it's hopefully based on sound understanding of politics in the region. And the issue is succession in Oman. We have a very close relationship, a security partnership, with the current ruler, Sultan Qaboos. He has been an absolute monarch of the country for 43 years, since 1970. He's a very busy man. He's sultan, he's prime minister, he's defense minister, he's foreign minister, he's finance minister, he's chairman of the central bank. And the issue of succession is very, very sensitive in Oman. People don't talk about it. In fact, if you ask an Omani what's going to happen after Sultan Qaboos, he'll often use the common refrain, "May he live forever." And this is not only a conversation stopper, but it's reflective of the concern that Omanis have, rightfully, about what's going to happen after. Sultan Qaboos has really united very disparate elements of the country, and Omanis are concerned that these old feuds may reemerge upon the Sultan's passing or absence. The good news is that he's in good health, although he does have an adventurous streak. Like the late King Hussein of Jordan, he likes to fly, and apparently he likes to surprise Omani air traffic controllers by flying very low, upside down, at low altitude, near the Muscat airport. So let's hope he's a competent pilot.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Again, Oman, another country that we often don't talk about, but if you look at a map, you'll see why Oman is just so important to the basic security issues which have been occupying this conference so much. If you're talking about choke points in the Persian Gulf, if you're talking about possible military action against Iran, you want to have access to an understanding of Oman. And traditionally, we haven't focused much on domestic politics in Bahrain and Qatar and Kuwait and UAE. But again, if you hear Chuck Hagel talk about the why we are so pleased that we have a security relationship selling tens of billions of dollars of weaponry to these countries, if they're hollow on the inside and they haven't been able to manage their own domestic politics well, no amount of F-15s or F-16s is going to work in having effective security partners to deal with the challenges that we face with them. So having Lori and her colleagues focus on these issues is just so important, and I'm very pleased that Lori, with her experience inside the intelligence community, is now back with us at the Institute and is doing really first-class work on some of these highly detailed and off the headline but very important issues of domestic security in the Gulf. So great, thank you, Lori. Next, Eric.
Well, thanks again for coming. It's really great to be with friends. Obviously in the past year I've traveled around a bit. I've gotten to visit some of you in your homes and certainly in your cities. So it's nice to see you in D.C. So thank you for coming and for your support for our work. Let me step back a little bit and just kind of tell you where we're at in terms of Egypt policy. When I moved to Washington in October 2011, this was actually before I was at the Institute full-time, I was already doing a fair amount of writing for the Institute and elsewhere on Egypt, and my assumption was that the debate in Washington would be how to deal with this problem that was emerging in Egypt, the problem being that a pro-democratic revolution was very quickly becoming a kind of an Islamist outcome. It was pretty obvious to us that the Muslim Brotherhood would emerge as the new ruling party. Then you had, of course, the rise of the Salafists as the number 2 party. And so I expected the debate in Washington would be all right, given this problem, given that radical parties are now taking over the most populous Arab country via elections. What should America do about it? And when I arrived, I was actually surprised that was not the discussion. The discussion was actually, 2 steps behind that. It was, this is fine, so how do we make sure that this stays fine? In other words, there was an inability to understand Egypt's trajectory and an inability to understand that the Brotherhood was not a moderate party, would not moderate in power, had totalitarian ambitions, and would remain hostile to U.S. interests, including to Israel. So that for me was very surprising, and I suppose I spent most of the first year and a half in Washington on the analytical side of the questions regarding Egypt. In other words, on the analytical question of trying to explain the threat that the Muslim Brotherhood posed to U.S. interests and the threat that it posed to any kind of democratic transition in Egypt. And of course, the Muslim Brotherhood was not the only threat. You also had a military regime for the first 16 months of the post-Mubarak period that did very little to help a more democratic outcome. But that was kind of where we were at and where we were making the strongest contribution, showing the threat of the Muslim Brotherhood both to U.S. interests and to a democratic future in Egypt. Now, in finally May 2013, we're at the point that Washington finally gets it. And the tenor of the conversation has moved from where it was a year ago. A year ago, we would have these meetings at the Institute and elsewhere where Rob and I and Dave Shanker and a couple others would say, we're very worried about Egypt. It's clearly not moving towards democracy. And everyone else would say, Egypt's fine. Oh, Egypt's fine. The Brotherhood will learn. They'll learn in office. They'll work across the aisle. They're sending people to Washington. They're saying the right things. Be patient. Transitions are hard. Well, fast forward to May 2013, and there is now really a recognition within the U.S. government that that is not the case, that those hopes have failed to materialize. And now the tenor of the meetings that we're having with U.S. government officials is sort of like this. Okay, you were right about the Brotherhood. You were right that they're not democratic. You were right that they're going to be hostile to U.S. interests. So now what should we do about it? And that's actually where I think the Institute has the ability to now make the greatest impact, because people are coming to us and they're saying, we should have listened to you. You were right. We should have squeezed them earlier. And actually just yesterday morning was at the State Department meeting with some Egypt officials who said exactly this. You were right. Now what do we do about it? And so moving forward, the work that we're going to be doing on Egypt will be in a couple of different directions, one of which is trying to find ways to squeeze the Brotherhood. Our view of the Brotherhood is that their ideology is very long-term and very unyielding. They are marathon runners. They have a long view of history. They want to establish a global Islamic state, as they call it. But with the right types of pressure, they can delay their pursuit of those goals. You can shape their behavior, not their ideology, but their behavior. So part of our work is going to be trying to help U.S. government officials locate the appropriate tools for affecting their behavior. The second part of our work will be on trying to locate and help alternatives to the Muslim Brotherhood, which runs a gamut of approaches, which could include speaking up more boldly for principles of democracy and freedom, as you heard Anwar Sadat, the nephew, say yesterday, but also maybe trying to see whether there are non-Islamist alternatives to the Brotherhood within Egypt. Because what we're trying to do is not just get the policy community on the right page analytically, but to also get them on the right page in terms of what the policy should be. And this is therefore a very interesting moment for us. I just want to comment briefly on the Brotherhood. Yesterday's incident with the Muslim brother who has fled, and that is the word that the Egyptian press is using. So that's a small victory. Is actually my second incident with the Muslim Brotherhood in 2 months. I'll tell you the story quickly. I was in Egypt in late February, early March, and on my last day, I interviewed a man named Mohammed al-Biltagi. And Biltagi is a top Brotherhood leader. He was also on on the flotilla to Gaza in 2010. My second time ever interviewing him. And during the course of our interview, I try to like get these guys to show the internal dynamics of the organization. So I said to him, you were passed over for the position of chairman of the health committee. He's a medical doctor in the last parliament. Why is that? Is that because you insulted the military and the leaders were angry at you because they wanted to be close to the military? And so I'm trying to, play with him. He says, no. I was on the National Security Committee. I wanted to be on the National Security Committee, and I'll be on it again in the next parliament when my role will be reforming and restructuring the Interior Ministry. That carries the implication the Brotherhood wants to take over the police, and suffice to say that if you're not a Muslim brother in Egypt, that is deeply worrisome. Anyway, 2 days later, I'm back in Washington. I'm giving a trip report, and I mention this. I say that he's going to be in charge of restructuring and reforming the Interior Ministry, and we live tweet all of our events. It's tweeted out. The next morning, I wake up, and it is the biggest news story in Egypt. And Mohammed al-Beltaghi, the Brotherhood leader that I interviewed, is on the air screaming Eric Trager is a Zionist and a Jew, and he hates Muslims, and he lied to me, and okay. So I said, all right, 24-hour news cycle, let this pass. My audience is not Egypt, right? So, all right, let him say what he wants. But it keeps going a second day. And I'm getting all these messages on Twitter and Facebook and email from friends of mine in Egypt. Why is he saying this? Is it true? And I realize that if I don't respond, people will wonder why I didn't respond. So I go on one of the major news talk shows in Egypt. It's called The Last Word with Yosri Fuda. And I say very calmly in English, I say, listen, I have no fight with Mohammed Beltaghi. This is what he said to me. And rather than explaining to the Egyptian people what he means by reforming and restructuring the Interior Ministry, he's attacking me. And I don't know why he's doing that. Many Egyptians are concerned about the Brotherhood taking over the police. And he should just explain to them what he means by that. And I just kept on that line, and he called back into the show and started screaming. Anyway, this played out very well among non-Islamists in Egypt who, my Twitter following kind of exploded, mostly in Egypt. So yesterday's event was the second run-in that we've had with the Brotherhood in the last 2 months. But I actually think it's playing an important purpose, which is that the research that we're doing and the way that we are, and I hate using this word, but I guess it applies here, engaging them, is definitely playing a role in revealing who they are. What happened yesterday is a top news story today in Egypt. People are accusing the Brotherhood of taking money, of leaving without paying, which happens to be true, of not doing their research on what the Washington Institute is, on looking very unprofessional, and so for the most part, our audience is of course the U.S. policy community, but to the extent that our research can help reveal this organization both to Americans and to Egyptians, I think we're playing a very useful role.
Thank you, Eric. Just one word about to play off on the phrase to underscore who they are. Put aside all the highfalutin analysis. One would expect that for the tens of billions of dollars that our nation invests in intelligence, that we would have just the most basic data, the most basic information, who they are. Who are the Muslim Brotherhood? Well, Eric, working with Katie. Katie, you want to raise your hand over there? Eric and Katie did something which you would think would be straightforward. You'd think it'd be done in every intelligence agency in the U.S. government, but it wasn't, which is to put together the who's who of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. The biographical data on, I think it was the 25, and then it was a larger number, the 25 senior leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. Who are they? Who are they? You can't go by the yearbook of, of Islam High. No. And this was like gold dust. This was picked up. This went around viral inside the U.S. government. I've seen Eric give briefings to various intelligence community officials. The most basic information, in addition to all the more sophisticated information. But it is so important that we're doing this. There are a lot of voices in Washington that compete for airtime, but when you can provide the most basic information, that's your access in. That's your door to being able to provide analysis and ultimately recommendations and policy ideas. And I think that we do this better than anybody else. So, Eric, Katie, thank you very much. Aaron, the floor is yours.
First off, I just wanted to start by saying thanks to Rob and everybody that supports the Institute. This is my one-year anniversary being here, where I first was exposed to the Institute at Lansdowne last year, and I feel very fortunate and lucky to have been able to work here the past year. I've mainly been working on issues related to jihadis and how they've evolved and how they're dealing with the aftermath of the Arab Spring and Arab uprisings. As we've seen in the news, especially 2 years ago when they first were starting nonviolent protests in Egypt and Tunisia, there was this whole narrative related to how, there are no Salafis, there are no jihadis in these protests, and that they're more or less irrelevant, and Al-Qaeda had been in history. But that sort of changed really quickly. They were able to take advantage of a lot of the changes going forward. And one of the earliest signs I saw of this was in April 2011, and one of the daily activities I do is go on jihadi forums, which is essentially where they post all of their statements and video messages and really get an understanding of the movement in general. And I saw a notice for the creation of this new group called Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia. And they're talking about having a conference in May 2011. And I was thinking to myself, this is pretty fascinating. Tunisia, of all places that we look at, is this bastion of secular society and the one that was going to succeed the most in terms of their transition to democracy. And there you have a group of individuals that are jihadists that are starting to set up shop, and nobody's talking about this at all. And the fascinating thing is that you can learn many lessons related to how jihadis have evolved through the case of Tunisia as well as some other cases. So I just wanted to briefly talk about 3 reasons why Al-Qaeda and their supporters have more or less been able to survive the last 2 years and come out even stronger than they had previously been. So the first main reason is that there are a large amount of prison releases in the aftermath of the revolutions in Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia, as well as even Syria for that matter. And you had a lot of individuals had been put in jail from attacks that they were involved in the 1990s. There were a lot of insurgencies in North Africa in the 90s. And so you have these old guys that were previously involved in the anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and they had blood on their hand from insurgencies in the 1990s, and they're just let free. Nothing. I would understand, since obviously previously they're under authoritarian regimes and they weren't put in jail under the rule of law, but at least retry the individuals and highlight the crimes that they did. But instead you have individuals coming back onto the scene. So one example of this is in the case of Egypt. You have Muhammad al-Zawahiri, who is the brother of Ayman al-Zawahiri, the current leader of Al-Qaeda, roaming the streets of Cairo, and he's now in a master's program. So he's back out on the streets, and previously he'd been involved with Egyptian Islamic Jihad, who's involved with a bunch of terrorist attacks in the 1990s, and he was also training in Afghanistan. And the original reason why he was arrested was related to a potential attack against the U.S. Embassy in Albania. And another case related to this is very significant, is the Tunisian case. The leader of the group Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, a guy named Abu Ayyad al-Tunisi, had previously been involved with the group, the Tunisian Combatant Group, and they were the ones who were responsible for the assassination of Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was the leader of the Northern Alliance, 2 days prior to 9/11 as a gift to Osama bin Laden, because they knew he was going to be a crucial ally of ours once we invaded, because Al-Qaeda did foresee that we would invade Afghanistan. The second lesson, or the second reason why they've really made a comeback, is that they've truly internalized the lessons of their failures and the excesses during the Iraq War. They've learned from it in many respects. As we've seen, they've been able to finally instrumentalize it in these open societies now. So you have them not just fighting and doing jihad and being violent in places like Yemen or Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria now, but they're also providing a lot of social services. If you look at Tunisia, you see it on a national level. They're providing medicine, they're providing food, they're cleaning up streets. I once was on the Ansar al-Sharia page on Facebook, and I saw them painting over this spray-painted wall, and I joked to myself, they're doing the Rudy Giuliani sort of strategy in Tunisia. But honestly, I mean, it's very worrisome because they have sort of expanded who is involved with the movement and their ability to gain more supporters. Instead of it being this more elitist movement now, you see that it's becoming a social movement in many respects, in the same way that we've seen with groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. And as we know, we've had a lot of difficult times with them over the last 20 or 30 years. And we see this growth in Tunisia on a national level. In Libya, we see this in Benghazi specifically. And in Egypt, we see this in Cairo and Alexandria. And even though there's still a civil war going on in Syria, you see groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and Ahrar Sham, who are the two main jihadi organizations that are fighting against the Assad regime. They're also helping out with the governance in the city. And this is the crucial point that people don't understand why they've gotten so popular. It doesn't necessarily have to do with them being really good on the battlefield, which they are. It more has to do with the fact is that they're fair arbiters in providing bread and fuel. People are trying to survive on a daily basis in a place like Syria. And previously, when you had some individuals in the Free Syrian Army being in control of some of the governance, they were looting this stuff and they're extorting people. And then you had these nice guys in Jabhat al-Nusra coming in and be like, here's a line, and we're going to pass this out, and we're going to do this in an orderly fashion. And they've been able to gain the trust of people, and now because of that, they have a larger base of support. And going along with this, the third main reason that you've seen Al-Qaeda and their sympathizers being able to sort of survive the Arab Spring is related to Syria in many respects. It's got a lot of religious significance to them, similar to Afghanistan in the 1980s. It's no coincidence that the media outlet for Jabhat al-Nusra is named Al-Manara al-Bayda, which means the white minaret, which is in reference to the great mosque in Damascus, where Jesus is supposed to descend in the end times to fight against a false Messiah. So there's a lot of millenarian aspects to what's going on in terms of the jihadists as well, and the fact that there are a lot of factors that have allowed this to become a huge jihad, similar to Afghanistan in the 1980s. Like Afghanistan in the 1980s, it is seen as a good war by the West as well. So you have individuals on the side of the jihadists who are against the Assad regime, but you also have the West against the Assad regime, and therefore, in some ways, it's a clean jihad, as it was in Afghanistan against the Soviets in the 1980s, as well as some of the fights in Bosnia and Chechnya in the 1990s, whereas last decade in the Afghan war and the Iraq war, it was obviously against the West, and it wasn't seen as like a positive thing that rebels were fighting against us. And therefore, you've seen a large stream of foreign fighters go into Syria. And I've been able to collect a lot of data based off of open source reporting in Western and Arabic media, as well as a lot of information that jihadists have provided themselves related to martyrdom notices. And Syria now can be considered the second largest foreign fighter mobilization in history after the Afghan jihad in the 1980s. It surpassed the Iraq war from last decade. And I've got a list of people from 60 nationalities that have made it to Syria to fight on the side of the rebels. And this, as we saw in Afghanistan in the 1980s, sort of was the core that led to Al-Qaeda in the first place, and then the insurgencies that I said before in the 1990s. And unlike in the 1990s, where you had a lot of stable governments and they're able to sort of deal with it, you have many Libyans and Tunisians in Syria now. What happens when they go back home? These governments are still very shaky and they're not solidified yet. We even see some of these issues going on in the Algerian-Tunisian border right now in terms of fighting between allegedly guys in Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and the security forces in Tunisia. Can they handle this type of insurgency in the same way the governments were in the 1990s? I think it's a huge issue that the United States is going to have to deal with over the next decade or so, and there's a lot of things coming out of Syria that we're really not going to like. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully didn't depress you too much.
Just a couple of quick observations to put this in context. First, the transnational nature of what we've been talking about. Just think about the places that Aaron and some of the earlier speakers from this panel and the previous panel, the places that we've mentioned. Not Albania, Thailand, Azerbaijan, Afghanistan, North Africa, Bosnia, Chechnya. We aren't the Washington Institute for Global Studies. We focus on, a certain part of the world. But to understand even that part of the world, you have to have your tentacles touching knowledge elsewhere. This is new. This is new for us. And if it's new for a fairly small, nimble, efficient organization such as the Washington Institute, imagine how complicated it is for a massive government intelligence bureaucracy, which is not to suggest they don't try to do their very best, but you can just imagine the organizational challenge involved of having all that information floating out. And that brings me to my second point, which is the technology involved. Aaron will be modest about this, but he is the world's expert on the internet aspect of the global jihad. He established, when he was even a younger man, he established a website called jihadology.net, which tracks all the most obscure statements by jihadi leaders of small groups, medium-sized groups, and all the crazy places I just talked about, and talks about the linkages and draws the linkages between them, which is really important because in the jihadi world, those Sykes-Picot borders don't matter. In the jihadi world, it is it's a trans-border, transnational enterprise. And so what Aaron does is really very important. And so we're very glad to have Aaron here. So before I open up for questions, I do want to ask you to give me a round of applause for all these fantastic young scholars. All right, floor is open. Please direct your questions to whomever you want to ask. Yes, Paxton.
I have two different questions to Aaron. How many undercover agents do you think are there in the jihadi movement?
Undercover on our side.
On our side.
I don't work in the intelligence agency, so I really have no idea.
Do you think there are?
In terms of homegrown terrorism in the United States, yes, the FBI has done a really fabulous job.
No, but abroad. I mean,
it's definitely possible, but if there are, we wouldn't know about it because then they would lose their cover. So it's definitely possible, but I have no insight into it, unfortunately.
Okay. And the other question I'd like to ask Eric about the speaker we had yesterday from Egypt, Sadat. Do you see him as a potential presidential candidate in Egypt?
It's a tough question. I mean, a good friend of mine, Sam Tadros, who's actually spoken at the Institute before, was saying that he views Sadat as the most reasonable non-Islamist choice. Do I see him as a viable presidential candidate? Probably not. But we should remember that a lot can change. We should remember that in, I think it was early March or late February 2011, Ahmed Shafiq, who was Mubarak's last prime minister, was forced to resign by a new round of post-revolutionary mass protests. And then 15 months later, got 48.2% of the vote against a Muslim brother in Egypt's first post-Mubarak presidential election. So a lot can change in the sense that people who don't seem very well known or very popular, I mean, clearly he has the name and he does have some popularity, but not necessarily a nationwide base of support. But that can change if he becomes a consensual figure for non-Islamists. Now, to his credit, he's someone who, and he voiced this yesterday, really understands the importance of participating in the process and understands that boycotting elections is absolutely a recipe for failure. So the fact that he's going to show up to quote Woody Allen, could be 90% of it. But I don't know that he even has presidential ambitions. For sure, though, he will be a parliamentarian in the next parliament because he's a Sadat from Minafia, which is like being a Kennedy from Boston.
Okay, thank you. Jim, on the far right.
First, thank you so much for everything you're doing. We're sitting out here listening to this. We're just overwhelmed. So thank you. I'm curious, I don't know how much you can get into it about this Muslim Brotherhood person who we paid for, came to the hotel, checked out. First, can you tell us how he was chosen, what the discussions were, and all the details, basically.
You want to know it all. All right. So let's put it like this: the Muslim Brotherhood's political party, the Freedom and Justice Party, does not want to talk to me and has not wanted to talk to me for a long time. I have over 100 top Muslim Brotherhood phone numbers, which means that they can have that policy, and I can always figure out who didn't get the memo. So that's how I still get really good Muslim Brotherhood interviews. And I knew that after trying to get somebody else, I knew that this was the type of Muslim brother who doesn't ever get that memo. So we invited him because we wanted a Muslim Brotherhood voice. He's really a credible leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. He's on their top legislative body. He's a former parliamentarian who will absolutely be in the next parliament. And we met with him, right. We met with him in October when we were on our presidential study group. And so we invited him, and he came, and he arrived, and I ran into him in the lobby on Wednesday night, and I said to him, you'll speak for 10 minutes, and Sadat will speak, and he said, okay. He knew who I was, and he left. He left actually with a guy who was from Central Casting, U.S.-based Egyptian Muslim brother, no question about it. And then yesterday at noon, I just went to call up to his room to tell him, be here at 2 for the panel, and he had checked out and didn't inform us. Now, what do I think happened? What I think probably happened is he saw the program, and he said that he withdrew because Zionist officials were participating. I think he saw that on the program there was an Israeli speaker and called back to Cairo, and they pulled him out. And I mean, this is this is very unfortunate, but I think at the end of the day, he would have been revealed one way or the other. He would have been up here on a panel getting questions from either you or Ambassador Ross, and it would have been unmistakable the radicalism of this guy and his organization, or he could do something also embarrassing, which is pull out without giving any explanation and making bad headlines for himself in Egypt. So either way, I see it as a victory for us. I would have preferred to have him on the panel, exposing himself ideologically, but he's shown his true colors through this way as well.
Yeah, we should have had a cutout and let him sit there with his picture.
For what it's worth, my own view is for him this was an enormous lost opportunity.
Right.
If he had walked in, smiled, sounded reasonable, didn't call the World Trade Center bombing a great success, didn't insult apes and pigs, and didn't say any of that, people would have walked out saying, not so bad. We can do business with them. And so in my view, this was an enormous lost opportunity and really shows, I think, a misunderstanding of what politics is, which reflects on exactly the way the Muslim Brotherhood is handling so poorly politics back in Egypt. So in my view, this is of a piece. Jeff, Erwin, Richard, then come back over here. Yes.
First of all, let me say that unlike Oman, Rob, you seem to have thought about succession, and you've done a good job planning it. Although I feel like saying to Dennis, may you live forever. I don't know if Dennis is still here.
Did you know something I don't know?
You guys are very inspiring. I must say, you raised the bar. This morning, Patrick Clausen said something fascinating, at least to me, when he observed that the Iranians seem to look at the Arab Spring a little differently than we do as a democratic awakening, but look at it as an Islamist awakening. And I wonder if each of you could address that from your unique perspectives, how what we refer to as the Arab Spring, Summer, or Fall is referred to in your areas of expertise.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Dan, you want to start? We'll just go down
Sure.
the order before.
Echo some of my comments of my colleagues. Al-Qaeda in Yemen is not your grandfather's Al-Qaeda. They've certainly adopted a soft power strategy of engaging communities and providing some basic services, principally justice, but also small scale things such as wells and humanitarian assistance, things of this nature. But at the same time, it is your grandfather's Al-Qaeda. They overreach once they have power, and they eventually sort of brutalize the population and turn them against them. And so Al-Qaeda in Yemen is fascinating in part because it's often been a pawn among many when President Saleh was in power there until a year or so ago. So a lot of their Al-Qaeda's strength sort of waxed and waned to some degree based on how President Saleh at that time would sort of cultivate them, or if only sort of turn a blind eye to their activities as a way of sort of fostering this perspective that only President Saleh can provide security to Yemen. And so, gosh darn it, look at all these unfortunate Al-Qaeda guys. You can't replace me as president. I'm the only solution to this issue. Al-Qaeda, because they took advantage of the Arab Spring in 2011, and by that, what they did is they essentially went out from their historic safe havens in the country, in the mountainous areas, and overran large swaths of the southern part of the country. They overran a provincial capital, several districts, established a rudimentary form of government. And for a population that had no government or a predatory government, or say even a tribal government that wasn't particularly appealing to them, this was well received because the Al-Qaeda had been preparing the battlefield, if you will, by engaging with the communities. They had also renamed themselves Ansar al-Sharia. Their message inherently is regarded as legitimate by many rural populations because it's based on the Quran. And frankly, also, Al-Qaeda in Yemen has a fairly large Yemeni component to it. It certainly has a foreign fighter element to it. But it's certainly more of our local boys, so to speak. And so Al-Qaeda's engagement's different. How it's responded to the population has been different. And as much as we may not learn lessons from our experiences, Al-Qaeda certainly has, although sometimes imperfectly. So Al-Qaeda used the Arab Spring to break out of their historic safe havens. As the Yemeni government has consolidated and stabilized, in 2012, the Yemeni government pushed Al-Qaeda out of these areas they had overrun. But they don't seemingly have the juice, so to speak, to sort of push on to finish the fight, if you will, in part because there are some great issues they have to struggle with in their own capital. And many of these areas are poor, they're impoverished, and like many small countries in many poor areas, they don't get a lot of attention. The cities and higher populated areas naturally do. So that's sort of how Al-Qaeda has taken advantage of this. They were generally seemingly well received, but they've sort of alienated the population. But they're trying to come back. They're already starting to say, we've learned our lessons. We're still new at this. We didn't mean to be so brutal. We're good guys. They're trying to come back now. The Yemenis are practical people. I don't think they'll accept it. But it's not a concluded conflict at all.
Okay, thank you. Lori?
Sure. The citizens of the Gulf countries have been strongly impacted by Arab Spring events in North Africa, and in fact, they've also influenced each other to a significant degree. Protesters in Saudi Arabia and in Oman were highly influenced by the Bahraini protests. On the other hand, the Gulf governments believe that the Arab Spring ideas are not necessarily applicable to their systems, and the best example of this is Qatar, which on the one hand supports people protesting for demanding their rights in North Africa and the Levant, but, for example, is prosecuting a poet for talking about the Tunisian revolution.
Thank you. Eric?
Yeah, just on the Iran question, the Muslim Brotherhood has attempted an outreach to Iran. You've seen Morsi go to Tehran. You've seen Ahmadinejad come to Cairo. This is actually something that Egyptians beyond the Muslim Brotherhood had spoken about in terms of the way that foreign policy would change after Mubarak. But I want to make 2 points on Iran. The first is that the Brotherhood's outreach is notable in that it's happening at all. No Egyptian president had visited Iran since the 79 revolution, and actually Iran had named a street in Tehran after Sadat's killer, Islambuli Street. So the fact that you have an Egyptian president going there at all is very significant. But when he went there, he was very tepid in terms of his outreach. He actually opened his speech by paying tribute to the Sunni successors of the Prophet Muhammad as opposed to the Shiite ones. So he's either not really trying to reach out, or he's a jerk, or both. It's hard to know. But the second point, and this for me was one of the big takeaways of this last trip, the Brotherhood's outreach, to the extent that it's happening, and it's definitely happening, has really earned it some domestic political backlash from the Salafists. The Salafists are dead set against any outreach to Iran for two reasons, one of which is the Salafists are total bigots, quite frankly, so they view any outreach to Iran as an attempt to Shiitize, which I don't even know if that's a verb, Egypt, to bring in Shiites who will take over tourism and make all Egyptians Shiites. So they have this very conspiratorial view. But the second and much more salient point that Salafists make is that the outreach to Iran is hurting Egypt's relations with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, two countries from which Egypt could be getting money to help its struggling economy. So that's a very interesting thing to watch, because historically the only foreign policy issue within Egypt that's resonated domestically has been the Israel issue and the peace issue, but now you also have outreach to Iran as actually a greater cause of concern. So that's a very interesting development. I don't want anyone to draw any real optimism out of that necessarily, but it is something that we're watching very closely.
Okay, thank you. Aaron, is this an Islamic Spring?
Well, the way Al-Qaeda has framed it is that this is just another continuation of the jihad that they've been fighting since the 1980s. When you look at this video message series that Ayman al-Zawahiri has been putting out for the past 2 years, he's on part 12 now. I'm anxiously awaiting part 13.
It's sort of like Glee. You have to really get into it.
You watch Glee?
No. No, but the Sultan of Oman does. That's a different story.
So they just view this as the people finally buying into Al-Qaeda's worldview and the way about going against the tyrant rulers. There is this 20-year plan that Al-Qaeda drew up called like the 2000 to 2020 plan. And the years 2010 to 2013 in their plan says the overthrow of the local governments. So they view this like this is happening, this is their time. So even though we have our own perspective on why this happened, they view this as things are falling into place. And they think that the final battle is between 2013 and 2016. So, they do not feel like they've been discredited. They feel like this is the best opportunity they've had ever, and they've really taken advantage in many respects.
Okay, thank you. Richard Irwin, and then we're going to come to this side, and I think we're going to call it quits after that. But please, Irwin, you use the mic. Go ahead.
Yeah. First, I want to thank the panelists for one of the most brilliant and upbeat mornings I've spent in a long time. But I want to pick up on the reference to Glee. That was very interesting. If each one of you was the policy czar of this country and you had one single thing you could recommend, because all your analysis has to lead to action. So I haven't heard any action. If you had one single action you could recommend, which one would that be?
And it has nothing to do with your salary increases. Okay. Okay. Let's go. Dan, you want to start this?
Sure. Sort of the bumper sticker answer to your question is sort of moving beyond what I consider a butcher and bolt approach to Yemen and sort of adopt a forward strategy. Instead of sort of relying on a drone strategy, which makes us feel very good because we can degrade Al-Qaeda, and it seems to be a low-cost, low-visibility approach. It only degrades Al-Qaeda. It never fundamentally will defeat it. And that will require, of course, a viable and active Yemeni partner. But that will only come about, part of that comes about through our own actions. And a lot of what our engagement with Yemen at present is focused on is sort of risk mitigation, force protection concerns. Many of our personnel never leave the capital. Our development and governance staff is a shadow of our counterterrorism staff at the embassy. And a lot of what we do is use high technology solutions. We throw money at problems. We have a short-term perspective on long-term problems. So, for example, the last 8 U.S. ambassadors to Yemen have each served 3-year terms. That has everything to do with the bureaucratic necessities of State Department HR. Then it has to do with having a tailored approach to Yemen and dealing with Yemen on its own terms versus treating it just like if it were France or Belgium. So in my perspective, because our bureaucracies are designed to deal with national capitals, national institutions, things of that nature, we need to organize ourselves like Al-Qaeda, which is operating very much like an insurgency, and have a flat sort of organizational structure that's light, lean, long-term, that's based in the villages in a partnership with Yemeni local officials. The problem from a career perspective for many bureaucrats in Washington is you don't make careers off working with local municipal officials. But you know what Al-Qaeda does, and so we need to be where they are. So I would say move beyond and supplement a butcher and bolt and really go towards a forward strategy.
Okay. Thank you. Laurie?
This is a highly interesting question for me, how to get, for example, the Gulf governments to do what we want them to do. And I have 2 young children at home, so I'm constantly thinking about this issue. How do I get my kids to do what I want them to do? And the latest theories, you probably know, are a rewards-based system, which actually I think fits the Gulf culture very well. And, they're used to bribes, which buy legitimacy to a certain degree. So I think this approach of offering rewards for the kind of behavior that we'd like to see, for example, responding a little bit more delicately to protesters and instituting reforms a little bit quicker than at glacial pace would be useful.
You know, it's a very interesting point that Laurie makes. I just recently wrote an article about stability in Jordan, in which I guess rather insensitively said the problem isn't too much corruption; it's the wrong type of corruption. It's corruption isn't going to the right people, and what we need to do is help them reallocate their corruption. Now, I rephrased it a little bit in the final product, but I think this is absolutely right. You know, we're not going to totally restructure their societies, but to reallocate incentives. I mean, we use these terms, incentives. What's an incentive? You know, it's corruption in some places. To reallocate these incentives is very important. I think it's a very important idea. Eric?
So my analysis of the Brotherhood is basically that the only time they moderate their behavior is when they believe they stand to lose everything. Now, historically, that's what the effect of the Mubarak regime was. I mean, the Brotherhood renounced the violence, participated in autocratic elections because they believed that if they didn't do these things and didn't tone it down, they would lose everything. Now, I'm not at all suggesting that you want to return autocracy to Egypt. What I'm suggesting is that you want to find the new tools that will make them fear that they stand to lose everything now that they're in power. And the tools that we've been pushing, starting with an op-ed that Rob and I wrote in the Wall Street Journal last January, right after the Brotherhood won the parliamentary elections, has been to condition all economic support, and including the IMF loan, on their willingness to work across the aisle and on their willingness to cooperate on key U.S. interests. And the reason why those are important tools is because if the Brotherhood truly believed that it would otherwise be governing an economically inviable country, that's where you might see something better. Now, the administration has been very slow and I would say hesitant to do anything that bold, and that's frankly true across a lot of policy issues. And so my response when I'm encountered with that kind of roadblock is fine. You don't want to make strong conditions. Show that you have a clue. Show that, through public statements that you understand where Egypt is heading, that you understand the Brotherhood is problematic. Speak out when they arrest journalists. Speak out when they crack down on activists. Another one who I just had seen in Washington 2 days ago was arrested today when he returned to Cairo. Speak out about the Brotherhood's undemocratic behavior, because by not doing so, we're sending the message that we are partners in the Brotherhood's very repressive takeover, and so at least signal that we have a clue as to what's going on. That is increasingly happening, but it's still been a tough sell because, frankly, the administration is very hesitant when it comes to Egypt.
Yeah. Just again, one more sentence on this. Just by contrast, when John Kerry went to Egypt last month, he brought with him a check for $190 million. And it's not as though it's a lot of money for a country that's billions and billions in the red. But because he brought the check now, rather than made this part of the package that the Egyptians only get once they do the IMF deal, it's a total mixed message. a mixed message to the Egyptians that they're going to get stuff without taking the medicine, and it's a message to our partners elsewhere that you don't have to have tough conditions on the Egyptians because we're not having tough conditions on the Egyptians. And the bottom line is very a gray message to the Egyptians when it really needs to be black and white at this time. Aaron.
I just wanted to start off by saying I agree with Dan's assessment, but in addition to that, at least in the case of the transitioning countries like Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, we see that most of the individuals that are getting involved with these groups are younger men. There's a huge youth bulge going on in the region in general, and what these groups are doing is empowering these individuals in many respects. They're showing that they can do something for their community. They're providing food. They're providing medicine. They're giving all this care, and therefore they feel as if they have some level of dignity. But the problem is this then creates a dependency within society. And also, many of these individuals are very well educated and bright, and they want to do something for their society. And therefore, I think there's a potential opportunity in terms of entrepreneurship and business partnership, and sort of using our way of understanding how to develop society in many respects can truly empower these younger individuals who do want to help out their society. The problem is that the outlet to do this in many respects is only through some of these Salafi organizations, but because people then become dependent on what they're doing, people can't then do their own thing in some respects. And if you create a whole new class of entrepreneurs, you create all these innovations, and then from there, that will hopefully, liberalize the society as well also, because you're having to deal with a lot of other individuals, not just within your own country, but, it's a global economy, so you have to be talking to people in Asia, people in Europe, and therefore hopefully being exposed, and over time, this will sort of filter out some of these more radical ideas. So, I mean, obviously, it's sort of a different type of idea on looking at this, but I think it's a potentially fruitful one that the United States should at least look into, and I would imagine it would be a lot cheaper than just doing things related to drones or other military types of technologies.
It's a very interesting point, because what you're hearing from somebody who's the online jihad expert is the flip side: is can we use globalization and in a positive direction, as opposed to the globalization of jihad, which is what Aaron focuses on in most of his waking hours. Richard, this is our closing question. Richard?
So I'm a little confused. How do they decide the division of labor? Do they go and they sit there and they say, well, we'll go to Syria?
Who's the they?
The jihadist.
Oh.
How do they go to Jordan? How do they stay away from Hezbollah and stay away from Hamas? Is there everyone understand their role? How is it coordinated? How come we don't see, or maybe we do, but in Gaza, how come we don't? I know there's an extreme version of it, but I don't. They help me out understand how they wind up all over the world for this very small numbers of people, as I understand it.
Sure. They essentially take advantage of any situation where they can operate. They're usually good in weak states, not in failed states. As we see in Somalia, they've had many issues going back to the 1990s, just because it's pure anarchy there. But in terms of weak states, they're very good at glomming onto a lot of issues that people are worried about and sort of radicalizing the individuals. Why Syria? Well, Syria is very important religiously for them, and it's also a key part of the Arab world, and they view it as sort of the stepping stone right now before they then go to Israel. You always hear one of their famous sayings is, "O Al-Quds, we are coming for you," in reference to Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. In terms of the question related to jihadis in Gaza or Palestine in general, one of the reasons is just that Israel's security is really good, so they've had a really difficult time being able to go against Israel in that manner, as well as the fact that they're not friends with Hamas. Hamas has been cracking down on these guys very much so since Hamas has gone into power. For example, in I think it was 2009, you had this individual in the Ibn Taymiyyah Mosque in Gaza announcing an Islamic emirate in Gaza, and afterwards you had a bunch of internal security forces from Hamas then spray everybody in the mosque, and they ended up killing like 30 people. So they've been cracking down just as much also. They're no friends of each other. So, internal Islamist fighting, I guess you can say.
So, it's layer upon layer when part of the story is how Hamas takes on even more radical jihadi groups, because Hamas now is sort of a state actor and has pretensions of being a state government, a state actor, and so one can play on the competing interests of this proto-state actor and this even more radical revolutionary actor, and we're seeing that, as Aaron said, play out in Gaza. So this is just a taste of the sort of stuff that goes on in the office every day. You can see the enormous variety of topics, places, countries, types of engagement, types of issues that we have going on every day at the office. We do about 100 events a year. There's about 230 business days a year. At least every other day, there's some event. When I say an event, there's a seminar, there's a round table, there's a foreign official, there's an intelligence officer, there's a military commander, there's a visiting this or somebody that coming in to want to talk with us about any one of a dozen issues, more than a dozen issues. This is what we do every day. These are 4 of our younger scholars. We have about 15, between 12 and 15, depending on the time of year, scholars from the executive director all the way across our senior fellows and program directors, and to our younger scholars and visiting scholars and military fellows. We have this great variety of experience, of different professional backgrounds, and it is a fantastic sort of crock pot, if you will, of creativity. That's a term I used yesterday. I'm not going to repeat what I said yesterday about the opportunities that we have with this enormous creative potential. But I think it's fantastic, and so I urge you, when you have the opportunity beyond this conference, come to our office, come visit our fellows, come see us in the regular order of business, see what we do every day. We're about to renovate our institute offices and raise the technological level of our offices, live streaming and all this sort of thing on VTCs and videos and all that sort of thing. But beyond all the technology, which is great, it's really the people that matter. And I hope you will agree with me, and I appreciated Jeff's remark about this, that these people and everybody from the Institute that has been part of this program are really just first class. And I can't be more proud of them than I really am. So please join me in thanking my colleagues.